I've been talking in this series about secularization theory, which is above all the work of social scientists, sociologists in particular. But in talking about secularization theory, I've been talking, of course, the reason why it's important here is because I'm trying to make sense of the spiritual environment, the religious environment, if you will, in which a church like Lewinsville does its work. And as I said at the very beginning of this series of talks, I think it's useful, indeed essential, for us to talk about these things in a serious way. Because, to be a little bit snide, there are unserious ways of talking about this, particularly sort of loose generalizations. You hear them in journalism, you hear them in sort of public life, and you hear them from the pulpit. The secular world we inhabit. And my guess is that when we hear that, everybody in the room, some image pops into your mind, just pops right there. And I'm suggesting here, and I don't want to be too extreme about this, that that's a problematic image. That image that pops into our minds, secular world. It's not entirely wrong, but it's wrong to a considerable extent. It simplifies what is in fact a very complex reality. What I'm trying to do is to complicate your thinking and my thinking on this topic, and to introduce you to at least one other way of thinking about it, which is my topic this morning. Just to review, last week I said the situation on this whole matter of secularity, growing secularity, has become in the last 50 years much more complicated than it used to be. If I were given this series of talks in the 1960s, it would have been different. But it's become much more complicated because of a whole series of developments. Now, before I go any farther, let me stress again one more time, won't be the last time, what I mean by secularity. Worldliness. That's the way I would define it. Worldliness, which is a little broader and I think deeper than simply something that focuses on belief. Sometimes people say secularity means, well, you don't believe in God. It's far more expansive, it seems to me. As I've stressed, and I think this is very important for us to make sense of our own church life. A person can be quite secular and also go to church. And again, let me just one more time to repeat that pastor who said to me, they're wonderful people, referring to the congregation, but they're so, and he actually said, bloody worldly. And of course what that means is, to use Bonhoeffer's language, is that people live their lives as though there were no God. Most, they come to church, of course a lot don't, but they live their lives essentially on a different premise. In modernization theory, especially the classical, sociological, and other kinds of social science theorists sort of looked at that and said that's what's going to happen more and more and more and more as our societies become modern. I've defined modernity in a fairly common sense way. My guess is if we were to have a discussion about this, we would say probably many of the things that I would list. Above all, it has to do with a way of thinking which is rooted in modern science and technology. But it's not just the fact that we take for granted modern science and technology, and we do, all of us. I know Lewinsville people, we all do. Not only do we take that for granted sort of as a practical resource, but we live our lives in terms of it. Max Weber called it a disenchanted world. It's a world in which you no longer believe in that stuff, at least a lot of the stuff that our forebears believed in. As I said last time, if you've got a serious medical problem, you may pray about it, but my guess is that most everybody in this room will not be content simply to pray about it. We rely upon a whole series of resources that are rooted in modern science and the technological fruits of it. Our family, we would we go off to on a regular basis, in our case, Georgetown Hospital, and all the resources connected with that. And we're delighted to be in a place where there is a university hospital, for obvious reasons. That's just one sort of living example. I could cite dozens of them. So it's understandable, especially against the background of the wars of religion, which gave religion such a bad image. Keep in mind this whole idea of secularization as a promising possibility emerged against the background of that bloodletting. In the 16th and the 17th centuries, in one country after another, in which our spiritual forebears were deeply implicated. They were involved. They were doing the bad stuff. Now, they were doing the bad stuff for righteous causes. Well, and I say that with a straight face. I'm not smirking. And many of the people that I've talked about in this room were God-fearing men and women who also had a sword in their hands. And frankly, we wouldn't be worshiping here if they didn't take some of those actions, to put it a little in realpolitik terms. We would be at some mass today. At least that's my view. That's my, admittedly, realpolitik view of the matter. Against that background of all that blood, all that suffering, all that pain, you can understand why, especially somebody moving in a secular direction would say, we're moving in the direction of ever greater secularization, and it's going to be wonderful. Going to be relieved of all that superstitious nonsense, and stop killing each other. That's always been the secular fantasy about this. And stop killing each other and be nice to each other. Get rid of that religion. Imagine a world without religion. Go back and look at the text of John Lennon. Imagine a world in which, and the clear implication of that odd assertion when you think about it is, if there's no religion, then they'll stop killing each other. Read a few books. Anyway, the idea was, 18th century in particular, with the spread of education, with the spread of science, with the spread of technology, with the spread of urbanization, all the stuff we take for granted, then there's going to be less belief, and insofar as belief endures, it will be rational. Rational religion. In the period from the 1970s on, the picture has become much more complicated than it used to be. It's always been, I want to stress, I said this last week, I want to say it again, the evidence, the body of evidence supporting this secularization theory has always been mixed. There's always been forward movement on some fronts in the direction of secularization, but resistance. All kinds of revival movements and so forth, drawing people back in the direction of the faith. But it's become so much more mixed now. And mixed in just a terribly contradictory way. That's the other thing. It makes your head spin when you start thinking about it and trying to get your heads to spin this morning. And here's what's so terribly, terribly confusing about it. In Western Europe, anybody who's traveled, I know many of you have, traveled and sort of traveled in a way that's allows you to get some sense of what's going on a Sunday morning, or there's this just been dramatic acceleration of what normally would be characterized as secularization. Churches in so many places are not quite empty, but nearly. And places where in the 1950s and 60s they were filled with, our experience with Scotland, just filled with parishioners. By the 1990s and thereafter, they were empty, largely empty. One country after another. And then, I've gone through this more than I can do this morning, but all the other indices are equally important. Dramatic decline in baptism, dramatic decline in Christian funerals. I want you to carry away that thought from this series. One of the more important measures of a spiritual life of a people is what happens on these rites, these moments, these pregnant moments in the life of any family. Do they baptize their children or not? Or do they say, even more dramatically, I am not going to do resulting in tensions within families. I don't need to go into that. Or, equally important, what happens when somebody dies? What happens, especially when it's, dare I say, a really important member of the family? If the patriarch dies, and the family says, maybe half the family says, or maybe even more defiantly, they say, we're not going to have that kind of event. Yes.
I was surprised in Germany to discover that you have to pay taxes and declare your religion, and then you're able to use the church. But if you haven't been paying those taxes, you can't get married or buried.
Well, that's part of what I'm going to get to in just a second. But there are those, I'm glad you brought that up, there are those very specific differences which matter in the way people think about this. The very fact that you react to that as you do is indicative of what? Of the fact that you come from a very different culture. I'm going to emphasize culture here this morning. So,
when
yes.
you talk about burials,
Yeah.
and you say that there's not as many Christian burials, do you mean that the services are not taking part in the church, but they're taking part at the funeral home, or they're just not happening at all?
Or if they happen, they're secular memorials. But a dramatic.
In my family, my grandmother had we had a graveside service, and there was a pastor, not hers, that was another ball of wax, and but it was an actual service. But my dearly beloved uncle, my Aunt Faith, no one else since then. The children have all been like, oh, it's just so much fuss and bother. It's just easier to have a cremation and move on. No one wants to be sad. And I'm like, well, I'm sad. But anyway, it's just.
I can't exaggerate the importance of this. And of course, we all sense this. Families sense this even if we don't discuss it in sort of elaborate terms. We know that something is going on when. Another example would be a young couple being married saying, we don't want any of that religious stuff. Well, what are they doing?
Well,
they're
they
making
already
a...
been married based
Well,
on my young cousin.
Well, they're making, let's say, in other respects, they're very sort of morally upstanding people, and so, but on that score, they're not going to do that. Anyway, get back to my key point here, which is in Western Europe, there has been a kind of sea change in that regard over the last 50 years. And all the proponents of secularization theory, without exception, you can guess what they would say. This is just a dramatic illustration that we have been right all along. Now I'll get back to nuance that in just a minute. Now the problem is that in so much of the rest of the world, but not all the rest of the world, something dramatically different has been happening. By the way, largely the European diaspora, Australia, Canada, and so forth, very similar things. Canadians look at us just like the Brits do with astonishment. Those Americans, about to get to that. So you have this, you might say, in very technologically advanced societies, perfectly compatible with secularization theory, in technologically advanced societies, one after another, this dramatic movement away from traditional religious identification with an ecclesiastical community which has rights and rights. But in so many other places, there has been literally a movement in exactly the opposite direction. These religious upheavals in the Middle East, with Pentecostalism in Latin America, with the explosion of Christianity in China and some other East Asian countries, there has been a kind of dramatic movement towards not just religion, but intense religiosity. And of course, in the process, religion has become a central theme of political life, which is also an important element of this. Many secularization theorists have said religion will endure, but in a very privatized form, and it won't have any political consequence. Well, think about the last 50 years. Think about the last 50 years. And then there's this other thing, which is very interesting. Two other things just to note. One is the sequel to sort of conventional religiosity in many lives, including many young adults. You raised that question last time. That's a very important part of the story. The outcome of this process is not sort of old-fashioned secularity. It's rather something else called spirituality. And when asked, all these surveys do, and not just surveys, I ask this question sometimes to students, well, if you're not going to be religious, say you identify yourself as somebody who used to be a Catholic, or my parents brought me up as a Catholic, but I'm not a Catholic now. Well, what are you? Well, I'm spiritual. What does that mean? Well, we go into a conversation about that, and by the way, I said last time I take that seriously. I'm not inclined to dismiss it casually. But what it says is the following. These are people who, while being uncomfortable with an identification with religion as they had known it, not what my parents brought me up to, I don't want to be a village atheist either. I'm kind of skeptical about those sorts of people. I don't want to be that, and there's something about religiosity that is worth holding on to. That's clearly the message. Search, another term that's oftentimes used here, is seeker. I'm seeking something that what fulfills that need, even if it's not the conventional form. And then, of course, we have this other thing, which is equally important, sort of making sense of all this sociology. Our time is a time of great migration of peoples. I need not tell you about that. Everybody knows it. We live it. I'm struck at Georgetown. Georgetown's fascinating. All those scarves, all those head scarves. I see them all the time. You know, now I routinely walk into class, there are 3 or 4 of them. You know? Those young women making a certain statement. And of course, in certain places, especially in certain countries in Western Europe, this is a profoundly important, not just religious, but political. And it's a sign, it seems to me, of the future. Globalization is bringing this mixing up of peoples so that the religious identity of the United States of America or France or whatever is complicated. Much more complicated than it used to be. Now, I could go on, but let me just throw in one other thing which I think is fascinating. Jack Calhoun brought this up briefly in a comment last time. I just want to underscore it. One of the most interesting things to further complicate the picture is what's going on in the intersection between religion and science. People in the scientific world have oftentimes been treated by secularization theorists as the prime example of what they believe to be the way of the future. And the assumption has been the more scientifically literate people become, the more they will naturally gravitate in a secular direction, meaning hardcore secular, unbelief. Now, their reasons for believing that are complicated, and I'm not going to dwell on that now, except to say the following. When you look at the actual empirical evidence, not some ideal image of what a scientist looks like, it's much more complicated than that, and it's getting more complicated today for 2 reasons. One, in many countries, including countries in Western Europe, people in the scientific community are as likely, it turns out, to be believers as non-believers. They're as likely to be, we've got some in this church, people who are involved in the life of a religious community as not, which is particularly startling in places where there's a strong pull, wider societal pull in the direction of non-association. And then there's this fascinating thing going on. A very, very important high-level conversation, oftentimes instigated by very, very prestigious scientists about dialogue between religion and science, about the deeper issues being raised by current scientific inquiry. That, I don't need to tell you, those of you who read, there are all kinds of books that appear on the bookshelves regularly about this phenomenon. And very often, it includes people who are, as I say, very prestigious members of the scientific community. Again, that's sort of puzzling from the point of view of standard secularization theory. Now, I could go on listing complications, but we've got to get on to the point. I'm winding up to throw a point, and it's this. You can explain all of the things I've just discussed which add up to, if I were to put it in one word, it's a complicated situation. And it's complicated because it seems to be the case. This is one of the things I want you to carry away from this series. It seems to be the case that we've got trends that are moving in sort of in opposite directions. Worldwide, we seem to have this kind of different pulls going on. Now, from the point of view of old-fashioned secularization theory, and if you want a good example of that in the bibliography I've distributed, the books by Steve Bruce, Scottish sociologist, some of the best on this topic. There are old-fashioned secularists. He would hate that phrase, but there are old. Everybody wants to be cutting edge, new. He's old-fashioned. Old-fashioned secularization theorists, defenders of the faith, I might even say, defenders of the faith will say, in a more, shall we say, nuanced way, I can explain all of this stuff. I can explain, and here's what they would say in 2-3 sentences, maybe 5. Here's what they would say. They would say, well, we now need to revise our theory because it's clear that secularization finally prevails, but it is only in the most advanced countries, like Europe. The most, I'll get to the complication in a moment, but in the most advanced countries and everywhere else, it's what? It's sort of, they're modernizing, even the United States of America. They're modernizing, but they're a little behind us. At least they're culturally behind us. And particularly, and they would say, developing the argument, if you look at where it is that the religiosity is most intense in the United States of America, it's in places that we Europeans in particular would regard as backward. Y'all. In other words, it's sort of pockets within the United States that are religious, and if you go to, let's say, New England, it's just like us. New England, in other words, is the future of the United States of America. The South is the backward part, or the Midwest. The Midwest is also kind of backward from that point of view. So, in time, it's going to take time, eventually, everybody will be like us. Of course, that's always been the standing premise. There's a single trajectory. It's moving ultimately towards the same. And the other thing that's oftentimes said, and this is absolutely right, got to be included in the picture, modernization as a process, oftentimes, at least in its earlier phases, does indeed produce intense religiosity. Look at the history of the United States. As you industrialize, as you begin this process, and they say that's what's going on in China, that's what's going on in various parts of Latin America. It is sort of modernization, stage 1, stage 2. That sometimes produces intense religiosity, but eventually you're going to get a completely secular world. I don't believe that. That's a plausible theory, but I think it's really problematic, and I want to give you now what I think is not the truth, but the alternative view, which it seems to me makes a lot better sense of the complications that we now encounter. All of what I'm going to say in the next few minutes comes under the rubric of, and here's the alternative theory, spiritual pluralism. Now, I want to stress, these words oftentimes sort of meld together in our minds. Pluralism, secularity, separate them. Keep them separate. A pluralistic world is not the same thing as a secular. A secular world is presumably homogeneous in terms of the topic we've been discussing here. A pluralistic world is not. A pluralistic world is full of variety and conflict and tension. It seems to me it's much better to think about what is going on in the world as a dramatic demonstration that modernization does not yield secularity, it yields something else. At least it doesn't yield secularity in any simple way. Now, why is that? What's the evidence? First thing, and by the way, I'm just drawing upon what I think are the better writings on this topic. Some of them are, all of these they're samples of all of them in the bibliography. one of the most fashionable, and I think one of the best theories in terms of making sense of the world today is something called a theory that is organized around the theme of multiple modernities. Multiple modernities. The articles in the list that specifically have got that in the title. Now, what's the idea here? I think it's probably an idea which anybody who takes cultural difference seriously will embrace. And that's one of the great motifs today of intellectual life in the social sciences in particular, sort of the embrace of the importance of the idea of cultural particularity, cultural difference. Now, let me use that to focus on the fascinating and very, very unsettling case of the United States. You already raised it in the issue, and I'm going to come back and talk about it in relation to Germany. I've said several times in this series of talks that from the point of view of anybody who writes seriously in this area, the United States right now presents an extraordinarily difficult case of anomaly. And as I've said, in Western Europe in particular, it is recognized to be an anomaly and people try to make sense of it. Here's the anomaly. This is a technologically advanced society. Indeed, from the point of view of many previous arguments about this, the United States is the most modern society of all. And the argument for that, again, probably reflecting experience that many of us have had, both on this side of the Atlantic and the other side of the Atlantic, is this. It's a wonderfully important difference to reflect on. The United States could begin, right from the beginning, as modern. There's a wonderful book on this called First New Nation. The very first new nation meaning what? Well, people came over here and they, in a sense, start over. They could just sort of create it. Whereas what? The process of modernization in Western Europe was always a process of struggling against a well-established set of traditions, some of them feudal, which what? Involved a struggle with those traditions. And to some extent, what life in Western Europe reflects to this day is that, those old traditions. Now, one could well argue from that point of view, as well as, frankly, the priority that we have attached, we as a nation have attached to science and technology, that the United States is the most modern country. Now, I hope you see the problem here. I mean, is the United States really less modern than France? Is it really? You know, is it maybe we can argue about that for a half hour, but I would say, in terms of many indices, the United States is clearly the most modern. And it's certainly more modern than so many Western European countries. But if it's so modern, how can it be a place which is so bloody religious? Now let me go back and emphasize just a couple of statistics that are in that Steinfels article. And by the way, I commend that to you as one of the best resources, Peter Steinfeld's article in that bibliography. I distributed some copies. It's just a wonderful resource for grounding, rather than just simply relying on impressions you have, grounding yourself in some data. One of the claims made there is 60% of Americans claim to pray daily. Now, I'll tell you, if you get into a conversation with somebody who's secular about this, or maybe even some people in this room that, well, you know, I don't really believe that. Well, okay, on what grounds do you not believe it? It's an astonishing claim. Almost half the American people, in survey after survey after survey, say religion is quite important in my life. Some say very important in my life. That's a huge number. By the way, it's a larger number than, watch professional football. The masses of people who watch professional football, that's not quite as large as the number of people who say, I am, what, religiously connected to some faith community. I know that some funny stuff can be done with numbers, but I assure you sometimes numbers are very, very useful in dealing with it. Otherwise, what have we got to deal with? Our impressions. The people who I hang out with. That's basically what it comes down to. The people I know. Now look at that number. The numbers are much lower in Western Europe. Religion, is it important in your life? On average, Western European countries, 15%. Dramatically different. But now back to the focus. Why would that be? Why is it that in the United States of America, there's a much higher percentage of active, let's call it active religiosity? And by the way, it's still true, even though we've had focus on young adults refusing to connect with the church, that's still, when you look at the numbers, a minority. Majority of young adults in that category are people who still identify with some particular faith tradition, many of them in an active way or semi-active way. Of course, the news focus has always been on the opposite. Now, back to my question. What explains this? Well, I think the best explanation, just I'm going to state it bluntly and boldly, is that the United States has a different history with regard to religion than all these countries in Western Europe. All these countries, going back to your point. It's a whole set of different traditions manifested in things like the one you referred to, taxes that you have to pay in order to partake in the services of the church. But the broad theme in recent writing on this is the following. We know this, again, from our own experience of these churches. They're all established churches. Established churches, that is, they have some privileged status in relation to the state, which creates what? A whole different dynamic in religious life in the country. The United States has always had, pardon the metaphor, a free market in religion. Now, that translates into, in the opinion of many people, and I think this is a very good way to account for the difference, a kind of dynamism in religion. When you've got state-controlled religion, you've got a different ethos. Americans have always been encouraged to what? Start your own church. I have my problems with that, but you understand. you understand what a different ethos that creates. Especially in some of the great vital movements of American religious history, the Great Awakenings were about what? Generating sort of almost spontaneous religious activity. Now, once you get that free market in religion, if I can put it that way, going, it tends to create a different relationship to organized religion, if I can put it that way, on the part of individual believers.
When you say organized religion, are you thinking about denominations?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm thinking about I'm talking about ecclesiastical movements which turn into structures, established structures.
And the purpose of my question was the non-denominational church is around a lot, yes?
Yes.
Okay. One other question.
But I would say that's in a way that's a perfect illustration of what I'm trying to point at here, that the American situation is much more conducive.
When you mentioned 60% claim to pray daily,
Yep.
I think you made a comment, but I didn't quite get it. I think you made a comment about what percentage of that, or how much of that we might associate with the spirituality versus religion. I mean, how do we know whether this is a reflection of the maybe more advanced secularization leading to spirituality separate from religion versus...
Yeah, well, I'm not willing to accept that premise.
Okay.
I think spirituality is part of the religious equation.
Okay.
But I don't have a statistic.
Mm-hmm.
It's just 60% of the people sampled say, in other words, what they're saying, I think, is I have an active spiritual life. Yes.
Two things on the Western European comparison. One is different century, I know, but certainly in 19th century England or Great Britain, there was a huge amount of what you're talking about: free market in religion, the nonconformists, some of the major Methodists, for example, earlier in the 19th century. So, at least at that time, that established church didn't seem to be a break on that. The second thing is, in modern times, are the non-established churches in Western Europe, and there are some, I mean, they're in the same boat, though, attendance-wise and so on?
I'm making, well, first of all, I want to agree with you. I think, in spite of religious establishment, there have been dissenting churches, to use the technical term. There have been dissenting churches, but the larger claim that's being made here is the very existence of established churches and all that entails. Tax as the basis for support of churches, established state practices in determining what is legitimate and illegitimate in church life and so forth. All of that creates an ethos which is different from the American experience. Yes.
The ends in my experience has not been that. Going to Notre Dame in Paris, maybe it's all Catholic that's causing this. But I think we've been to 3 services at Notre Dame, 2 on Sunday and 1 in the middle of the week. They're packed, and they're not with Americans because it's February and March. That's number 1. Number 2, Poland, Krakow. We had to stand in line to get in a church at, it was either the 8:30 or 9:30 services. And Krakow, university town, you would think not many people would be religious. Absolutely packed. People were sitting in the aisles. In Rome, back in December, church, now this was a Reformed Presbyterian Scottish church, almost full. And so just picking randomly churches to go to, we have not had that experience. And yet I think about, where are these, what is it? Is it just the Catholics? But in Rome, obviously, it was Reformed
Well,
Protestant.
let me, well, there's so much there. Let me just make a couple of observations. I'm not going to argue that there are not exceptions to these trends, but the trends with regard to religious identification in Western Europe are so
Yeah, you see that.
and the other thing is, I would say, especially if you're going to sort of take particular cases, let's not focus on the big cathedral that is the magnet for all kinds of people. I mean, in Scotland, for example, you go to St. Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh, and it's got a reasonable, I would say not terrific turnout, but a reasonable. You go to the suburban parish, that's where you get the dramatic evidence of what I'm talking about here. But the other thing I want to say on that point is, even within Western Europe, there are significant national variations. The secularization trend has been much less pronounced in Ireland, in certain parts of the Catholic world, and interestingly enough in Switzerland, than it has been in, shall we say, the countries that are more prominently emphasized these. Yes?
Just to add to that, the church that I grew up in Norway, when I was in the confirmation class, and it was filled with Norwegians at Lutheran Church. I went back about 5 years ago, and there were hardly any Norwegians in the church. It looked like the United Nations. And I think that takes to your point. Everybody in that church was from somewhere else. Very
Well, and the other complication here, which I've already alluded to, but let me just underscore it here. Globalization has a counter-current effect, countercultural effect, if you will, is that people who come from other parts of the world find their way into these churches. But that doesn't, it seems to me, alter the fundamental fact about the native population. Now let me summarize this point and move on. Multiple modernities is a broad theory which suggests what almost, I think, once I articulate it, will sound like a truism to you. And it's this. Yes, modernization, as it moves across the face of the earth, to some extent produces the same thing. Sure it does. Modern science, modern technology, urbanization, education, all that stuff. And yet, in each case, it interacts with a particular national tradition, national culture to produce somewhat different consequences. It's going to be different in China than it is in France, than it is in the United States of America. And even within the United States of America, when you think about it, you've got these regional subcultures. Why is the South so different? Is it just because it's backward in the sort of standard? No. I think it's more complicated than that. Yes?
Well, and when I'm down at the beach, I go to this little church in North Carolina, and it seems that in these little less urban communities, the church is the center of everything that they do. And so when you get to a big city and metropolitan area like us, you've got Sunday soccer and all these other things that people are doing. But down there, all their activities, their social life revolve around the church. Is that
Well, now let me be
true?
a little bit blunt.
All right.
That's what these secularization theorists have in mind when they say religion flourishes when there is a more backward environment, where there can be a center of the community like you described, as opposed to the more complex environment of an urban area. Now let me go on to what I think is an even more important point, is this. All these are variations on the same basic theme. I think the great lesson of the last 50 years, it's a broader point, but the last 50 years with regard to religion, like a lot of other things, is the following. What modernity does is not secularize in some unambiguous way. What it does instead is the following. It creates opportunity for choice. Let me say it again. It creates opportunity for choice. I mean, we know it in our own lives. Less constraint, less dictate. You are going to be this kind of person. You are going to be whatever. And by the way, it's true with regard to politics as well. When I was in graduate school, many decades ago, the standard assumption was if you knew the politics of the parents, you knew the politics of the next generation. And it was statistically demonstrable. Well, not so much anymore. It's much more complicated. Why? Because people, their life situations change, but also they have more choice in these matters. I think it's one of the reasons why there's so much more independence in that category. That is, party identification. The largest single category which is growing is independence. People who refuse to identify, and that's not just an American pattern; it's a broader pattern as well. Now, what that means is the following: rather than thinking that the outcome of modernization is going to be what people thinking a certain way and that way is secular, it's probably better to think the following: the outcome of modernization is going to be ever more dramatic illustrations of the variety among human beings in terms of their spiritual, shall we say, aptitudes. I know people who say, I don't know whether this is the truth, but I've got a couple of good friends in particular who say, you know, when it comes to religion, I just don't get it. And it's not polemical, it's not a hostile remark, especially to me, it's just, I just don't get it. And I think that means that in terms of all of the things that we associate with religious life, and I would say more broadly spirituality, there's just a lack of the needs that many of us in this room, or a lack of a sense of the needs that many of us in this room feel. At least that's what they express. I'm just not that kind of person, when I say. I'm just not that kind of person. Now, at the opposite end of the spectrum, if I can put it in terms of the spectrum, at the opposite end of the spectrum, and we're seeing this dramatically revealed, it seems to me, in the last several decades, is people who have just the opposite sort of sensibilities. They're drawn to various things that would be commonly identified as religious with a kind of passion. And they feel somehow that their lives are, strengthened, enriched by being able to give vent to that and embody it. So you got, if I can, again, put it in terms of the spectrum, you've got this range of possibilities in terms of just the empirical evidence from people who are almost a-religious, at least in terms of their instincts, to people who are intensely religious. Yes?
I see that more as a circle, because oftentimes people who are intensely religious become disillusioned. They put their all into it, they're expecting. Who knows what they're expecting, and they end up becoming a-religious.
Well, that's true. That happens. There's all kinds of variety here. And I guess that's the point I want to make, is that it seems to me in the situation we find ourselves in, as a result precisely of the changes that have taken place through modernization, people are able to not only give expression to their differences, but also to cultivate, to develop them. Yes?
Through the last couple weeks, I've been thinking about the phenomenon you said Americans are sort of more religious than are showing that, and why is that happening? I sort of think it's sort of like a false religiosity in the sense that it's politicized a lot. That a lot of people are using religion as the hook for the social or political goals that they want. Now, they may have gotten those goals, they think, from reading the Bible or whatever, but still, they've become religious because they want an end point. It's not really a religious point per se. it's just politicized. So I view a lot of the backward right-wing religion as sort of a false religion because it's just the vehicle they're using by somebody on TV who's helping them do that. So I don't know how deep that really is beyond the political goal that they want.
Yeah.
And that seems to me to
Well,
mess it up.
I think that's absolutely part of it, and I think that's again part of what has to be taken into account in making sense of what has been going on in our own country. But Adrian, I think that's not enough to explain fully the strength, the continuing strength, the persistence, if you will, of religiosity in the United States. Because it was there before. It has surged in a certain part of the population. I agree with you. That surge might be linked to, and it's not just political, let me say, in the narrow sense. It's, in many cases, it is that religion provides a legitimation for certain cultural attitudes that people have. You know, I am angry about this, I'm worried about that, and I can find legitimation for that belief in a particular form of, let's say, Christianity. That's absolutely true. But even if, I guess the question would be, even if that were not there, if we could somehow just say that didn't happen, or let's say it literally didn't happen, would the United States be like Western Europe in this regard? I'm inclined to be skeptical. I think there's something rather fundamentally different here. And it's not just the fact that we're separated by the Atlantic, because Canada clearly is like France on this topic. Betty, you had a comment?
Well, I was just going to say that to speak to your choice and variety issue is that what modernity has allowed is tolerance for variety, and that it's made it culturally acceptable to be who you want to be. So you don't have the restriction, the force, the cultural demand that you go to church on Sunday morning, but you have the freedom to not do that. So I think that's what lends the flavor of secularity. It's just that there's more culturally acceptable variety.
I agree with that, and I think it's part of the package. When I say choice, I mean there is more opportunity for choice, but equally, choice has more legitimacy. And it's legitimate because of this ethos of toleration. Now, my prediction is that that trend will continue and continue ever more strongly in the years ahead, with the result that there will be, and I want to stress, variety is not the same thing as secularity. Because somebody can be intensely religious and embody choice. Indeed, in some cases, you see in the history of families, that's precisely what goes on. One generation, and this is one of the fascinating things about this mix that's developing. Actually, in some families, there is more intense religiosity now than there was in the previous generation. Now, from the point of view of secular, and sometimes with highly educated people, from the point of view of secularization theory, that's crazy. How can that happen? How can somebody use the opportunity to choose to become more intensely devout? Well, it makes perfect sense if you're thinking choice is what's being opened up here, not rather some particular path towards secularity. Let me add now one other thing, which is very interesting. There's a theory now which is mainly articulated by Western Europeans, and ironically, they're Western Europeans who have a history of being very strong proponents of secularism. That is, that the secular way of life is the good life, the way to think. I think in particular of a famous German legal theorist and political theorist named Jürgen Habermas, and there's an article from him, a rather popular article, easily accessible in that bibliography. Here's the idea. Related to the phenomenon of choice, what sometimes happens, he says, not always, but sometimes happens, once people have really been exposed to, quote, a dogmatic secularism, they react against it. Mm-hmm. They react against it and they say, that's not for me. And they react that way in part because of precisely what this dogmatic secularism represents to them. That is, ironically, a kind of version of what they rejected to in religion. And he characterized it. He says, I think we're seeing more. And he says, ironically, among younger people in Western Europe, we're seeing evidence of that. They're looking at our generation. He's now in his 70s. Our generation and all that dogmatic secularism that we represented, and they're saying, no, I don't want to live that way. And the label he puts on that is post-secular. I hope you see why. It is literally a response to that goes away from what is a well-established secular environment. Now, I think all of that is going on. And I hope you see why all of that adds up to a different way of thinking about this whole phenomenon, especially the emphasis on choice and variety than the secular standard secularization theory. Now, let me go to one final question in anticipation of what we're going to be talking about next week. Implicit in all this is a huge practical but also philosophical question. If there is persistence to religion in highly modernized societies, and the strong likelihood of its continuation, so that if we were here 50 years or 100 years from now, there would still be religion, not rampant secularity. How can that be? Which goes to, of course, the question, well, what is the function of religion in people's lives? That's the deep question. What's the point of religion? Now, I've said to you that it seems to me most all secularization theory has a tacit assumption about that. And it's this, that religion is a primitive technology. I think it's implied in the snotty things that they say about us. Let me put it that way. What they say about us, and you've heard this metaphor before, is those people need a crutch. The crutch of religion. How many times have you heard that?
Opium for the masses.
What? Oh, that's another one. That's another. But I hope you see what's involved. In other words, if they had a better life, if they had a more up-to-date way of thinking, they wouldn't need that crutch. Okay? Now, the thing I want to suggest is, in order to explain this stuff, you've got to have more, it seems to me, than just, if I can put it a little crassly, the crutch theory of religion. You've got to have something different, and I want to propose it's the following. Religion, of course, has many functions. People are religious, and they have been historically for many reasons. Some of them are just social. Some of them are social in, you might say, a deep sense, and that is, we see this all the time, and that is they continue to be religious. They hold on to religion because of some cultural attachment, especially in the case of immigrant populations, that's true. Why do you want to hold on to that faith? Well, you might say the reason we suspect is because it's a representative of something about their heritage that they want to maintain. Something precious about their heritage that they want to maintain. That's part of it. But I think the deepest reason might be characterized this way. Human beings ultimately seek, at least many seek, a larger and deeper meaning in their lives than can be achieved through merely mundane activities. And by merely mundane activities, I mean the kind of stuff that most of us do all the time. You know, Monday morning, what do? We get up and we make a living. We get up and, do all that stuff, all that practical stuff. That's the way we spend most of our hours. And you might say that a secular existence amounts to what? Just devotion to those activities, devotion to those pursuits. Well, why would somebody given that find that less than satisfying? Well, one reason that's commonly advanced, which it seems to me is a very good reason, is people, at least many people, are ultimately seeking something deeper and something larger by way of purpose in their lives than just what mundane activity provides. Christian Smith, who has written a lot about adolescence and thought a lot about this, You've heard a lot of echoes of his thought here. Moralistic, therapeutic, deism, you've heard that phrase. Characterization of, very troubling characterization of adolescence. One of his fundamental claims in his sociological writing is that human beings are fundamentally meaning-seeking beings. Meaning-seeking beings, and that's one of the most important functions of religion. It lifts us out of, you might say, the narrow details of our mundane lives to give them larger meaning and purpose. Indeed, he says, when you think about the great historic world religions, what they have done is to link our lives to some cosmic purpose. It's a wonderful phrase. Link our lives to some cosmic purpose. And he says, I can't imagine that going away even with the most sophisticated technology. Indeed, in some respects, he says, the more sophisticated our technology becomes, the more we're in need of that kind of resource. See you next week.